All right. Hello, fellow classmates. Today I was going to go over Carl Rogers and B.F. Skinner and their theories. Carl Rogers was born in 1902 and passed in 1987. He was the fourth of six children. His father was a successful civil engineer, his mother a devout Christian housewife. When he was a teenager, his family moved to a farm 30 miles west of Chicago, where he became rather isolated, independent, and self-disciplined with strict upbringing and many chores. He went to the University of Wisconsin as an agriculture major. Later, he switched to religion into ministry. He was one of 10 children chosen to go to a Christian conference that was 6 months in Beijing. It broadened his experiences, and he began to question some of his basic religious views. After his graduation, he went on to Union Theological Seminary, where he took a class that changed his course again, and Rogers switched to clinical psychology program of Columbia University and received his PhD in 1931. He began his clinical work at the Rochester Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, working under Otto Rank and learning that his theory and therapy techniques. Rogers began developing his own approach to the client-centered therapy. In 1942, he wrote his first book, Counseling and Psychotherapy. Rogers' theory is a clinical one that he developed through his counseling experience with his clients. Rogers saw people as basically good or healthy and believed all individuals strive to make the difference of their existence. His best-known contributions to therapy is non-directive therapy. He felt therapists should not lead the client, but therefore be there for the client and let them direct the progression of the therapy. In his best efforts, Rogers realized the importance of therapists, that clients look to therapists for direction, which therefore he changed the name to client-centered. He felt clients should still be able to identify issues, find solutions for improvement, and determine a conclusion for their therapy. Therapy should be supportive and not reconstructive, and he uses the analogy of teaching someone to ride a bike. You can't tell them how, they have to do it themselves. You can't ride the bike for them, they have to do it themselves. You can't hold them up the whole time. There comes a time you have to let them go, and if they fall, they fall. It's a learning process. Whereas if you hang on, they will never learn. One technique Rogers used was mirroring of emotional communication, also considered active listening. A client says, "I feel horrible." The therapist will say, "So life is getting you down," basically rewording something that they had said in a different way, and it kind of opens it up more for, establishing a relationship and understanding. Rogers also established 3 qualities that a therapist should have. 1 was genuineness and honesty with client. 2 was empathy and ability to feel what a client feels. And 3 was respect, acceptance, and unconditional positive regard towards the client. Rogers felt with these 3 qualities, a client will improve even if no other techniques are used. If a therapist lacks these qualities, the client's improvements will be minimal no matter how many techniques are used. Development of personality in the humanistic perspective. Self-concept. All our thoughts and feelings about ourselves go into answering the one question, who am I? In the development of self-concept, Rogers saw that in a positive, unconditional environment, the individual has an opportunity to fully actualize themselves. Whereas an individual raised in a positive, conditional environment only feel worthy if they match the conditions that have been laid out by others. In other words, more environmental. Rogers also talks about the congruent person and the incongruent person. The congruent person realizes their potential is not at the expense of experiencing positive regard. They lead lives that are authentic and genuine. The incongruent person, in their pursuit of positive regard, live their life that includes falseness and they fail to realize their potential. Conditions are put on them by society that make it necessary for them to forgo their genuine, authentic life because they are trying to meet the expectations of others while denying who they truly are. They struggle to work hard at maintaining and protecting their self-concept. They deploy defense mechanisms, which are distortion and denial. Distortion occurs when the individual perceives that the threat to their self-concept, they distort it until it feels. Distortion occurs when the individual perceives the threat to their self-concept. They distort it until it fits into their self-concept. Denial follows same process, except distorting, they deny the threat exists. The defensive behavior reduces the consciousness of the threat, but does not eliminate the threat. As an individual tries to protect self-concept, the threat grows bigger, the individual becomes more defensive, and their personality becomes disorganized and bizarre. The Christian perspective on Rogers. So Rogers believed people were basically good. On the Christian perspective, people are born in sin, having both good and bad, good and evil. Rogers believed the environment determines how they mature, like a predetermined life. On the Christian perspective, God gave people free will. Choices led to different results. So it's not predetermined and it's not based on the environment. Rogers' theory creates unrealistic expectations. When a person reaches self-actualization, relationships will be satisfying and experience freedom from inner conflicts. On the Christian perspective, life is going to be a struggle, regardless of self-actualization. Jesus was the most self-actualized human, and yet he faced struggle as well. And Rogers basically focused more on the self, whereas the Christian perspective focused more on God and others and less on self. Next, I was going to go on to discuss on B.F. Skinner, and his background information was quite interesting as well. He was born in 1904 and passed in 1990. He was born to a lawyer father and his mother was a housewife. He grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. His brother died at 16 of cerebral aneurysm. He grew up loving school and building things. He got his BA in English from Hamilton College. He wrote newspaper articles on labor problems, lived as a bohemian in Greenwich Village in New York City, and traveled some. Before he went back to school, he went back to Harvard and received his master's in psychology in 1930 and a doctorate in 1931 from Harvard. Stayed there to do research until 1936. In that same year, he moved to Minneapolis to teach at the University of Minnesota. He met and married Yvonne Blue and had 2 daughters. His second daughter became famous as the first infant to be raised in one of Skinner's inventions, the air crib, which was more than a combination of a crib and a playpen with glass sides and air conditioning. In 1945, he became the chairman of the psychology department in Indiana University. In 1948, he was invited to come back to Harvard, where he remained the rest of his life. He stayed active doing research, guiding doctoral candidates, and writing books. He became one of psychology's best writers, including the book Walden 2, a book about a fictional account of behavioralist-created utopia run by behaviorist principles. In 1971, he wrote Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which suggests that individual freedom is an illusion. Skinner's behaviorism theory, brought about by operant conditioning theory, a type of learning in which behavior is strengthened if followed by a reinforcer or diminished if followed by a punisher. Skinner conducted research on shaping behavior through positive and negative reinforcement and demonstrated operant conditioning, a behavior modification technique which developed in contrast with classic conditioning. The idea of BMOD was to put the subject on a program with steps. The steps would be setting goals, which would help you to determine how the subject would be changed by the following steps. The program design would be helping the subject to reach the desired state, then implementation and evaluation, which is putting the program to use, and then evaluate the effectiveness of it. Example of this can be seen in use as the token system they use in prisons, and whereas good behavior, they're awarded with points or receive coins. Bad behavior, they subtract points or take away coins. The Skinner box is more where he did a lot of this evaluating, where he placed a rat in a special cage, a box that he made that had a bar and a pedal on one wall. When pressed, caused the device to release a food pellet into the cage. The rat moves about the cage, accidentally presses the bar, and a pellet is released. In a short amount of time, the rat realizes this, and whenever it wants food, it touches the pedal. So the principles of operant conditioning, the behavior followed by the reinforcing stimulus results in increasing probability of the behavior to occur in the future. If the rat presses the bar and continuously does not get food, the behavior becomes extinct when the rat fails to press the bar. Again, the principle with the operant condition there is the behavior no longer followed by the reinforcing stimulus results in the decreased probability of the behavior occurring in the future. The schedule of reinforcement. Now, if you turn the pellet machine back on so that the rat presses the bar again and the rat is provided pellets, the behavior of the bar pushing will be resumed more quickly than the first time because the return of the reinforcement takes place in the context of the reinforcement history that goes back to the first time the rat pushed the bar. Also, he went into more like fixed ratio scheduling. So if he had set it up where the rat had to tap the bar 3 times and got a pellet, it would be a fixed ratio of, okay, the rat would learn that every time he pressed it 3 times, a pellet would come out. If he changed it to 5 times, where he had to tap it 5 times, then a pellet came out, and so on and so on. A variable schedule would change it up to where every time the rat would never know how many times he had to touch the bar before the pellet was released. So if it was, he had to touch it 3 times to get 1 pellet, 5 times to get 1 pellet, 7 times, it was so changing that the rat never knew. By changing the variable on the schedule of when the reward would be released, this caused it to be more likely that it would extinct. The behavior would extinct. Like the rat would get tired because there was no shape, there was no pattern, no rhyme in the learning process of that. He also developed shaping, which was a method of successive approximations, teaching animals tricks. So if, you're trying to get a dog to sit, and it's a process of teaching them how to do such a thing, as long as they're close to the desired behavior that you want to get them to, you would give them a treat, and then they get progressively better and better until you get the achieved results of getting them to do what they need to do, which is, if you wanted them to sit or roll over. Aversive stimuli is the opposite of reinforcing stimuli. Is a behavior followed by an aversive stimulus results in a decreased probability of the behavior occurring in the future. For example, for this is like a shock collar on dogs. If a dog is having trouble and is running all over the neighborhood, you can't keep them fenced in. A lot of times you can put a shock collar on them, and it would receive a shock every time it reached the limit of the yard. Once the dog knows the perimeters of where it's not going to get shocked, most likely it's going to stay in that yard. It's not going to go beyond those perimeters. Criticisms from a Christian perspective. Skinner had mistrust of the religious systems greatly influenced his view of the world. Skinner based science of behaviorism so that humans are basically programmed predetermined lives without free will, that their environment determines how they're going to turn out. Christian perspective is that God gave man free will. Life is not predetermined. Skinner believed that the environment determines human behavior. Christian perspective is that the environment can influence behavior, but it does not necessarily determine it. Skinner's operant conditioning is limited to external behavior conformity. Christian perspective is to restore the image of God in man, and that involves inward and outward transformation. And that concludes my report. Thank you.